Hey guys, what's up? My name is Jimena, and today we're going to be talking about the way that we see the world. But before we get into it, I wanted to give a quick acknowledgement that today is the 50th annual Earth Day. And the reason that I point this out is because it has been a very historically important day for the environmental movement, and I kind of just wanted to give a little brief history of Earth Day. So the first Earth Day was in the 1970s. On this day in the 1970s, 20 million Americans, and at the time this was 10% of the total US population, took to the streets, parks, and auditoriums to demonstrate against the impacts of 150 years of industrial development, which had left a growing legacy of serious human health impacts. And this was pushed by a lot of unique voices during this time period, and this historical movement eventually led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as other laws like the National Education Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and many other important pieces of legislation that have protected hundreds of species and human lives as a result of their implementation. And so I just thought it was important to acknowledge the historical backing that this day has. And I also wanted to acknowledge that it was in fact President Nixon who enacted a majority of environmental legislation, which, just throwing it out there, means that these issues are bipartisan. They affect both parties equally, and this should be something that we are fighting for as a collective. It should not be a red or blue issue. It did not start as a red or blue issue. It took 20 million Americans coming together to acknowledge this day for it to grow into its eventual global phenomena. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that before I get into this video, because we are going to be talking about the way that we see the world, and this maps that we see of the world are truly where everything that we know has ever happened. This is where we live. Every great and terrible memory that we've ever had has all happened on this exact same earth, and the way that we view it, I think, is very important. And so without further ado, I just want to get into the map portion of this video. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of background about what we truly are celebrating in these times. So anyways, so this video is supposed to be about maps, and I think maps are the key to how we see everything. This is how we know the world around us. And back in the day, like, the earliest forms of maps were just reference documents to acknowledge where things were. There was no set rules. There was no set format of how maps could be made. And over the years, as we learned more about the world, newer maps came along, and one of the most significant first maps was, and I don't know how to say this exactly, but Ptolemy. My name gets said wrong all the time, so I hope I said it right. But this was one of the first maps, and it was very mathematically focused because it was one of the first maps to have designated lines as guides across the map, and this eventually ended up being adapted into what we know today as latitude and longitude coordinates. And so a lot of the maps that we see today have those exact lines, regardless of how distorted they are. They try to keep them there so that we have some sort of perspective. And it's really hard to just create the perfect map because we're taking something the shape of a circular three-dimensional figure and we're trying to lay it out on a flat two-dimensional piece of paper. And so of course, no matter what, there is going to be a lot of distortion. For some things, it doesn't really matter, but it depends what you're using the map for. And so I'm going to be talking about 3 specific types of maps today. And so the first one that we're going to cover is the conic map. And this interpretation is, imagine putting the geoid, that is the earth, inside of a cone. And so the places where that geoid intersects the cone is where the map is going to be the most accurate. So this isn't really a map that's going to be most useful for looking at the entire globe as a whole, but if you wanted to just look at specific regions, it would be a very helpful interpretation to look at. In reality, their usefulness only comes down to regional sections of the earth, not the earth as a whole, because the further you go north or south of the map, the less accurate that you're actually going to be. The next map interpretation that we're going to be talking about is the planar map. And so this one is really good for looking at either just the northern or just the southern hemisphere, or literally anywhere you want, but only part of the earth at a time, just because the way that it just pretty much takes a snapshot of one section of the earth. And these maps are also very useful, but in a different way. So if you wanted to, say, use it for navigation, which actually this is a really good interpretation for air travel, because when you're traveling from point A to point B, let's say you're going across the Atlantic Ocean from somewhere on the East Coast to Europe. If you wanted to go across and you were looking at a typical map like the kind that we're used to, such as the Mercator interpretation, you would think that the easiest way to get across is just to go straight across the Atlantic Ocean. But actually, the best and fastest way to get across the Atlantic Ocean over to Europe from the East Coast would be to go over Greenland, which you wouldn't guess, seeing as we always look at the Mercator interpretation for whenever we reference going anywhere. But actually, if you were to have a globe and put a string from point A to point B, you would see that that string would go across Greenland because it is the fastest way. And the only way that you would know that is either through looking at a globe and putting that string on there, or looking at a planar interpretation of the map. And on a typical map, this is called the Great Circle because it takes into account the curvature of the earth. The next interpretation that we're going to be talking about is the cylindrical interpretation, and this is the kind that we're more typically used to seeing. And this is just taking a cylinder and wrapping it around the globe and just showing where everything is. And so this specific interpretation of the map is a lot more accurate the closer you are to the equator, but the further you get towards the poles, the less accurate it is because it doesn't take into account the curvature of the earth. But the latitude and longitude coordinates do kind of help you guide where you are in a way, although on a plain two-dimensional form of the map, it's not really going to be that accurate. So whenever you take into account any type of interpretation of the earth, it's going to be distorted in some way. There's no way to make a perfect two-dimensional version of a three-dimensional object. And so it's really important that we realize that whatever version of the map that we're looking at, it's going to be distorted. And so the reason that I wanted to talk about the Mercator interpretation is not only because it is one of the ones that we're most used to seeing. We've probably seen it in all of our classrooms or in World Market or in any art shop where we just see maps of the earth as the aesthetic. They always use the Mercator interpretation, but it's very important to note that this is one of the least accurate forms of the map because of the shape. And so the Mercator interpretation was created by somebody who was from Europe, and so the way that they created the interpretation was that they outlined everything in Europe perfectly to its correct shape, and then they zoomed it out and just tried to fit everything as casual as it could to make it visually appealing. But in fact, if you look at Africa on the Mercator interpretation and you look at Greenland, you would think they were like nearly the same size, but they're nowhere near the same size. Africa can fit almost all the continents inside of itself because it's such a big area, but we wouldn't know that if we were just to look at the Mercator interpretation. So there was another interpretation of the map created called the Gao-Peters interpretation, which tried to solve this problem, and it kind of did, but it's still a very distorted map. So you're either gonna sacrifice shape or you're gonna sacrifice size. You're gonna sacrifice something whenever you try to create a more accurate map. So the Gao-Peters interpretation actually shows you a more accurate size of each continent, but it's still not accurate. And so as you can see here, this is the difference between the Mercator interpretation and the Gao-Peters, and it's not perfect in any way, shape, or form, but you can at least see that the shape of each continent is a lot closer to its actual shape in real life. According to Google, the most accurate interpretation of the map is actually the athograph interpretation, which was created by a Japanese architect, and it keeps both the size and shape of the continents very accurate, although it looks a little bit funny. But from what I've read, if you cut it out, you can actually shape it into the earth but you know, it looks like a little bit weird just visually, only because we're not used to seeing it. We're used to seeing the Earth mapped out as if it was just a perfect two-dimensional visual aid. I don't know what to call it, but I just wanted to make this video to kind of talk about the main different types of interpretations of maps, because there are an infinite amount. You can look at the world in so many different ways, and you don't have to think that north is north and south is south, but that's what we are conditioned to look for as the standard. And so it's pretty it's pretty cool to know that there are other ways to look at the world. But yeah, I really hope that I taught you something about how every way that we look at the world is literally just perspective. There's one perspective, but that doesn't mean it's the right one. Yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. This is one of my favorite subjects next to weather. And so if you want to see more videos like this, please be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And I hope to see you guys next time. So yeah, enjoy the rest of your day and don't forget to go hug some trees.